Hey, how are you doing? I'm very happy to see you again in my YouTube channel, and today in this episode I would like to meet you with one very interesting person. He's a writer, and he has a book, Angels and Aliens. The story in that book based in the true story. It's very interesting, it's very fascinating. All my interviews there with very interesting people, very credible people, and they have stories and they would like to share that story with the world, especially with you guys, which have interest about the UFO, paranormal, human consciousness, what kind of abilities we can develop using our consciousness. And I believe that interview, that story, will take your breath. Thank you very much for watching, and I love you.
My name is Phil Wright, and I'm I currently live in Saratoga Springs, Utah. Yeah, the name of the book is Return from Rysa. Rysa is a planet, it's a place. And the book is interesting because the book talks about a group of people that were taken from the earth thousands of years ago, and they were put on Rysa, and one day they will return from Rysa back to the earth.
That's interesting.
I mean, that's the premise. But book one really tells the story of a little boy named Connor, who at age 4, he and his 5-year-old brother were abducted by aliens. And that abduction continued for several years throughout their lives. We said in the book when we wrote it, we called it a parable based on true events. And we did a lot of research, so we interviewed and found many abduction stories. And it's kind of a compilation of all of those types of things. But again, it's based on true events. The two characters in the beginning of the book are Connor and Christopher. Connor was 4, his brother Christopher was 5. And it starts out in 1965 in a little town called Oroville, California, which is about 45 miles from the capital city of Sacramento. Yes, both Christopher and Connor for years would tell their stories to each other, and occasionally they would say a few things to their parents, but not a whole lot. Most of the information came back to Connor much later in life. So when the book was put together, Connor and Christopher both were able to collaborate the information in the book. Christopher and Connor were both abducted, I think like so many people were, they were abducted by the Greys, as we refer to them. Connor discovered that they're from a place called Inicia, so he referred to them as the Inicians. They had a planet very much like Earth, but over generations of time, they essentially destroyed their planet, and the reason that happened is because they had eradicated most of their diseases, so suddenly their population was living 3 and 4 times longer, and they didn't have the resources to feed their people. So, and I don't talk about this in book 1, this is more in book 2, but what their scientists did is they captured how do I explain it? They captured a meteor and built a dome around it for a second satellite, a moon, for their planet so they could control their weather. Because they needed to have more regular seasons, less seasons, they needed to have more sunlight so they could grow more crops, so they could feed their people. But by adding this second satellite, it caused major catastrophes on their planet. It caused earthquakes, volcanoes, that eventually started killing off a lot of their population. Then civil wars broke out. The planet is rich in resources. There were a lot of caverns underground. The population essentially began moving and living underground. Here's what the Anisians did quite often to abduct people, is they would project certain words in a person's head, put them in type of a hypnotic trance, and call them out to them. They didn't do it in broad daylight. They didn't do it in places where other people would discover who they were, what they were doing. And Connor was known for sleepwalking most of his life. Then discovers really it wasn't sleepwalking. He was being lured by the Anisians, usually at night, to come out to them where they would find him and abduct him. And when Connor was abducted, it was actually, I take it back because it was the middle of the day, but he lived on a house that was kind of out in the country, surrounded by pasture and farmland. And his house was on about a 2-acre plot. In the middle of the day, he was playing in the backyard. It was a school day. His older brothers were at school. He was home with the babysitter. His parents were at work. He was out playing in the backyard, and he saw this strange-looking kid that he thought standing out by the fence. Connor wanted to have friends. He had a very mean babysitter who loved the baby's sister and would actually lock Connor out of the house most of the afternoon. So Connor would be outside playing by himself. So he sees this strange-looking boy, and it's like, well, maybe there's a friend. So he innocently goes up to this person, and when he gets close, then he gets scared, and this person starts talking with him, and Connor says, "You look really strange. Your eyes are big and your head's larger. What's wrong with you?" And the being is saying, "Well, you look strange too." They're kind of having this discussion. And Connor says, "Well, what is your name?" And he said, "My name is Ektak." "What is your name?" And he said, "Connor." And then Connor says, "Ektak, that's a really stupid name." They were speaking probably, I want to say telepathically, but I don't know. It may have been speaking in English so that Connor could understand him. Mm-hmm. But again, Connor says, "Ektak, what a dumb name." And he says, "Well, Connor's a dumb name too." So this being kind of creates a relationship with this little boy through deception. And says, Connor says, "Well, where are you from?" And he says, "Well, I come from that ship." And he points way off in the distance, and Connor can see this silver football-like thing way out in the field. And he says to Connor, "I'll bet I can beat you there." And Connor says, "Well, I'm not supposed to leave my yard." And he says, "Well, is there anybody around? Can anyone see you leaving?" And he said, "No." So this being pulls up the barbed wire fence, and Connor climbs through it. And Connor hits him and says, "Tag, you're it." And the next thing Connor realizes as he's running is that Ektak is not next to him. He's already at this ship. And when Connor gets to the ship, then he's terrified. And that's the last thing he remembers right there. Because he realizes now this is a spaceship. And this is not some weird-looking boy he's talking to. This is, he's only 4 years old, but he's old enough to understand this is not normal. This is not an airplane. This is not a helicopter. This is something scary. So, but then, he was taken onto their ship, and they tagged him, put a tag in his shoulder. They inserted a tag, and later that day, he told his brother about what had happened, and his brother didn't believe him in the first place. And he said, "Ektak was really nice. Ektak is my friend." So the next day, Connor and his brother, Christopher, were out in the field playing in a large oak tree. And Connor said he had to run to the bathroom. And his brother said, "Well, you can urinate outside." He goes, "No, I have to do the other thing. I have to go back to the house." So when Connor went back to the house, this same being, Ektak, appeared. and got Christopher. Christopher resisted, but he was eventually tagged, and when Connor came back, Christopher wasn't there, so Connor was very worried. He climbed up in the tree and he waited for a couple of hours, and then finally he saw Christopher walking back, and he could tell that he was upset and terrified, and Christopher sees Connor, and the first thing he says is, "Ektak is not your friend." So Christopher was more of the protector, and he was not trusting at all like Connor. He was very protective of his little brother, and he knew the experience that he had was not good, and that's why he said, "Ektak is not your friend." Connor and his brother Christopher had many encounters that happened at the exact same time. And then, about the time Connor was 10, excuse me, Christopher was no longer part of those encounters. So Connor doesn't know if Christopher was having something separate or not, or if it ended. Years later, he finds out from Christopher that no, it never ended, but they were no longer being abducted at the same time. There's one thing I write about in the book where they're actually on an Anisian ship, and they're both laying on their backs on a table, and they're restrained by some type of restraining devices, and Christopher gets away, and there were about a half a dozen of these Anisians, and they scurrying around him to try to restrain him, and he jumps up, and he's only 5 years old, but he pushes one of these Anisians. He just thrusts this Anisian against the wall, and it fractures the skull of the Anisian and kills him. So that was an experience where Connor realized that maybe they were in danger, and when they were abducted, subsequently after that, they were a lot more careful with Christopher than they had been at that time, because they realized he was pretty strong for a 5-year-old and very determined. One of the things they did is they would get in a person's head, and they would put them in a trance by repeating their name over and over. It was like, Connor, 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 Connor. And that would create the trance so that they could direct you to do what they wanted you to do, to lay down, to follow, to whatever. And Christopher was always defiant against that. Well, they learned that the Greys were not necessarily cruel. They weren't trying to hurt or kill anyone. They were doing genetic research, and part of their research was to help strengthen their own race, because they had basically manipulated their own genome. They had contaminated their, I'm going to call it human DNA, with plants. And part of the reason for doing that was because they were living underground, and they were looking for ways to survive without constant vitamin D from a sun. They were looking for ways to survive underground, and they ended up manipulating their DNA, and they became a human plant type creature. And they got to the point where they could no longer procreate. Yeah, they could no longer procreate. So they were looking for ways to save their race by finding the right genes, human genes, that they could reintroduce back into their gene pool and hopefully start creating their own children again. Well, most of the time the beings spoke telepathically. They didn't verbalize very often.
Okay, yeah.
They would make strange squeaking sounds occasionally. But most of the time, the communication must have been telepathic. And I'm saying the Anisians, when they were taking blood samples or adrenaline, their favorite thing to do was to take adrenaline, because they had discovered that adrenaline actually gave them longevity and it gave them additional energy. So it was one of the substances they liked to take. Because the Anisians were the first race that Christopher and Connor experienced. But there were several other races, including a very benevolent race called the Rysan, and that's what this book is called, Return from Rysa. And the Rysan are very tall, maybe 8 feet tall. They're very, very bright colored people. Their skin is just very bright.
Like Scandinavia, for example.
Yes, but very bright.
Or
They had white hair, bright blue eyes, and their eyes were a little bit larger than a human's eyes. But they were a very benevolent race. And one of the things that Christopher and Connor learned about the Rysan is that they were from a terrestrial planet. So their planet had gone through a progression of where we would consider we live on a telestial world, and I'm speaking more of a spiritual thing. We live on a telestial world. Well, the Rysans, their planet had become terrestrialized, so they didn't have blood in their veins like we do. They don't breathe oxygen. They're a very different type of humanoid. Connor and Christopher rarely got sick their whole lives. They came from a family that has had heart disease, cancer, all kinds of things. They've never had any of that. They've never had high cholesterol. They haven't had any of those typical things that came from their family. So why? Well, maybe it's because they were interacting and touching, receiving DNA from terrestrial beings. I know that Connor and Christopher talked about it most of their lives, but there was a time when Christopher didn't want to talk about it anymore. And he didn't want to remember it. He didn't even want to deal with it. But Connor could never let it go. Connor wanted to remember everything. Mm-hmm. He wanted to understand why. You know, one of the unique things about this book, it's not just about aliens, it's about angels. And one of the things, you know, people will say, well, if a child is abducted that many times, they're going to go absolutely crazy. They're not going to have any sense of security in their life. They're going to be an absolute mess psychologically. And I would agree with that. But for Christopher and Connor, they also had visitations from angels at the same time. And the angels would basically tell them that God created worlds without number. He put his children on all those worlds, and he gave each of them agency so they can make their own choices. Some choose good, some choose bad.
And maybe they have ambitions.
That's true. And then they would tell Christopher and Connor, when you are abducted and they hurt you or do things that aren't nice, it's not that God has turned his back on you. It's that this is part of your life experience and you're going to be okay. Just know that there's still a God and he still loves you and he will protect you. So at the same time they're being abducted, they're also having angels come to them and tell them, you're going to survive. You're going to be okay. There's a reason for all of this. If you believe in God and that he created the universe and planets everywhere, and if you think he only put children on one planet, that is the epitome of arrogance, to limit God's ability. Why would he just put children on one planet if he created worlds without number? Surely he put children that look just like you and me everywhere, everywhere. So to say that anytime someone talks about an alien abduction or the Watchers or any of that, it's evil, it's just demons. Again, that's just a weak mind. That's a person who's not willing to look around. Well, yes, I mean, any being that comes from somewhere else is an alien, right? Mm-hmm. if you're talking about heaven and an angel comes from heaven, they would be considered an alien because they're foreign to this planet. But the difference is an angel being sent by an omnipotent God is not coming down to do experiments. They don't come down on a spaceship. They're not coming for the same purpose. So they're two very different beings. One is literally a heavenly messenger from God, and one is a being that has its own agency to choose right from wrong. Yeah, well, I don't look at it as technology. I look at it as spirituality, because I personally believe that light is the source of all knowledge. Light is the source of everything. And God has complete understanding and control of light. Everything he does, let there be light, comes through light. And angels can be anybody. They can be you or me. We can act in the capacity of an angel if we're doing something to help somebody else. So let's assume a Rysan, for instance. Rysans travel on ships. But if they've been given an assignment, let's say by God, to go here and save this person, then they're acting in the capacity of an angel, but they're physical, human-type beings like you and I. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas angels, I believe, can be physical beings, or they can be spiritual beings that are sent directly from God. Whether they're coming on a beam of light, I don't know how they come and go, but there's a very distinct difference between an angel from God and a being from another world. And that's one of the things that Connor and Christopher learned early on, is that they were being abducted by beings that had agency to do some not so nice things to these little kids. But God was sending angels to give them comfort and protection, to let them know the things that are happening to you are happening for a reason. Just be courageous, have faith, know that God hasn't turned his back on you. You will survive. Where they were living in Georgia, and they were attending a Wednesday night church meeting or something, and a massive UFO, a big typical round UFO, hovered over the church, and it was so low that they could see the workmanship in the metal underneath it and the lights going around. Easily the size of a city block. It was massive. And there were about 8 women who also came out of the church and witnessed it. One of them fainted. But when Connor and Christopher, their parents, actually witnessed this, finally they can say to their parents, okay, what we've been telling you for years is true, and we want to tell you some more things that happened. So it wasn't until that point where Connor and Christopher would have been, I think 12 and 13, that they started telling their parents about some of the experiences they remembered, and now their parents are thinking, well, maybe there's some truth to that, because nobody could explain what they were looking at. They knew that it wasn't an aircraft from the U.S. Air Force. They knew it didn't make any sound. It had a bright light that came down, and this little group of people standing around like a bunch of monkeys. The light shined right down on everybody. Like I said, one lady faints. And there's Connor and Christopher like, yes, finally, now I can get my parents to believe me. 6 or 8 women, plus Connor's mother, Connor's father. Connor had a friend with them, I think his name was Terry, and Connor's brother. They all witnessed this. The next Sunday, not one person said a thing. Not one person said a thing. And it's like, and Connor was upset. And he said to his mom, how come no one's talking about it? And she goes, shh, we don't talk about those things. This would have been outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a town called Sandy Springs. You know, if I worked on a top secret project for the government and I was sworn to secrecy, and it had to do with aliens, and I discovered that aliens were coming to our planet, and we knew that, and we were interacting with them. And then I'm getting to the end of my life. I don't care what I agreed to, I would spill the beans. Because it's like, what are they going to do, kill me? I'm 85 years old, I'm on my deathbed, I want my grandkids and kids to come, I need to tell them something. And I would tell them. So, you know, these women would be in their 80s. I would think by now some of them have probably started to speak. I would. Look, I personally believe that God did create worlds without number, and he put children on it that look just like you and me. I believe that many of them have advanced to the point where they can do interstellar travel. The reason I don't buy into the interdimensional, I think the reason scientists or whatever are pushing that is they can't understand how a being could travel so far to get here, because we think of speed of light and 1,000 light years away, and you can't travel that fast. So instead they say, oh, it must be interdimensional, and they're right next door, or they're right next to us. I don't buy that. I believe that they have found ways to travel. In the book we talk about a light tunnel, which is kind of like, I guess, a wormhole, but there are light tunnels that go everywhere. And even though they have craft that can travel faster than the speed of light, if they're 50,000 light years away and they can travel 2 times the speed of light, it would take them 25,000 years to get here. But if they can use their craft and travel in a light tunnel that can get them here in 15 minutes, then I believe that's how they get here from other galaxies, from thousands of light years away. Yeah, they found a way to manipulate gravity. They use gravity and warping of space-time to move their ships to travel. And it also protects them against inertia. That's why you can see ships that do stuff like this, where you and I, our bodies would be all crumbled, we'd be flying all over the place. Well, they have the technology to eliminate inertia and to move any direction they will themselves instantly.